It is high time South Africa completely abandons the use of race and racialism in our policies and in our laws. Any political party that is fighting against this racism deserves our support. Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Welcome to another episode of the Big Daddy Liberty Show's Vlogs edition. My name is Sihle Ngobese, aka Big Daddy Liberty. Remember, if you're enjoying this content, of course, guys, hit that like button on YouTube and subscribe to the channel. Also follow Big Daddy Liberty on all your social media posts. Now, enough with the jibber jabber. How about we get straight into today's issue? That's right. Today's issue, of course, revolves around the Democratic Alliance challenging in the Pretoria High Court the Employment Equity Amendment Act. This is a piece of legislation which is long in the books in this country, of course. You'll know the ANC, much like the broad political left in this country, are no different to colonial and apartheid politicians of yesteryear. What do I mean by that? Well, these same politicians of today, Afro-nationalist politicians of today, are insistent on holding on to the relic that is using race to determine South Africa's winners and losers. Yeah, boy, I'll say that again. The ANC and much of the left in this country, the race-obsessed left, are no different to the politicians of colonialism, colonial era, and apartheid, in that they literally use the same racial categories to decide South Africa's winners and losers. And this, the use of race, I'll make the broader point, and I'll call it this: immoral. It is completely immoral. If it was immoral under the colonial days to segment people by race and then decide what opportunities they can or can't use, if it was immoral to do that under the apartheid days, indeed apartheid being declared a crime against humanity, it is immoral today to use race to determine winners and losers in society. And it does not matter that you hide now under the fig leaf of saying, well, we use race today, they say, because it's redress. We're fixing the past, they'll say, as to a justification on why they use race. No. It is a relic of the past, which sadly the ANC and much of the political left in this country, who are race obsessed, continue to use, even as it continues to divide South Africans. This, for me, is why I'm supporting the DA's current stance of fighting back against the further encroachment of the use of race via the Employment Equity Amendment Act. Now, I want to separate issues here. There is my stance and, of course, what the DA is doing. Now, the DA is going to court about the specific EE Amendment Act, and it has very particular parameters around what it's operating on. I'll get to that in a moment. I am making the broader point, which is my detesting. I completely find detestable the use of race in any of our laws and policy making in this country. It is something, as a broader goal, I would like to see the complete scrapping of. However, I also recognize reality, which is, slowly but surely, you have to win the argument around this, and it will be a gradual process, and it is that gradualism, if you will, which I think typifies this case by the DA, which has taken this matter, of course, to the courts. As I mentioned, in the Pretoria High Court, it is on the one side, the DA, fighting back against this racist piece of legislation, the effective use of quotas by the Minister of Labour, who is the first respondent, and of course the Commission for Employment Equity as the second respondent, and a few other respondents on this matter. And let me touch very briefly on what the DA's case is. And the DA is effectively arguing in court that the Amendment Act, in now fixing the numerical targets under the threat of severe sanctions for non-compliance by the department, by the state, is clearly unconstitutional. That's the DA's argument on this. And indeed, here's a DA representative speaking outside of court, laying out their argument here.
Section 15A of the Employment Equity Amendment Act makes or gives the minister way too much power with regards to determining certain racial quotas within certain sectors. And then this act also gives enormous penalty powers. A company with more than 50 employees that does not adhere to the requirements of this act will be punished by fining them with 10% of their turnover, not 10% of profit, 10% of turnover. And if you take away 10% of the turnover of a company, most companies in this country will not be able to survive. If you are an Indian person in KwaZulu-Natal or a colored person in the Western Cape, and all of a sudden countrywide geo standards are applied with regards to employment equity in your specific area that you live, it will mean that an Indian person in KwaZulu-Natal will not be able to get a job, or colored people in the Western Cape. And that is discrimination. It cannot work. This act or this amendment will not contribute towards job creation. Every South African must have a fair opportunity and fair access to have a job. If we want to rescue this country, we've got to grow the economy and we've got to create jobs.
Yep, that is the DA spokesperson on this particular court case, giving a brief outline of what their actual case is about and the imperative behind it. But I want to go to the DA's court papers, which give a bit more context on this matter, which read as follows. Now, the DA, speaking about the existing act and this new amendment and why they're opposing the amendment, they detail what currently is the situation, saying, currently and crucially, this obligation is context sensitive. Every designated employer is required to formulate and implement numerical targets which are responsive to its unique position, including the degree of underrepresentation in its workplace and the availability of suitably qualified people from designated groups to remedy this underrepresentation. I want to take a moment here. Effectively, the DA is saying currently the law, even though it also prescribes for effectively racial makeups of workplaces, still takes into account any difficulty an individual firm that hires 50 or more people would have in maybe sourcing someone from the quote previously disadvantaged groupings, and because of that recognizes those limitations and gives time for that organization to make that racial change over time. This new amendment to the act now sets hard numbers in a one-size-fits-all by the Minister of Labour. That's an immense amount of power for that individual to actually have, and then sets punishment, hectic punishment for a firm that does not comply. Effectively, that same passage reading as follows. The Amendment Act would replace this approach with one that is impermissibly rigid and one size fits all. If the Amendment Act comes into effect, every designated employer would have to follow, quote, numerical targets set by the Minister of Labour, referred to as the Minister, in this, regardless of the degree of underrepresentation it suffers from and its ability to remedy that underrepresentation. If the designated employer fails to make its workforce fit the particular demographic composition required by the relevant ministerial target, the employer would face the prospect of severe penalties, including the inability to do business with the state, the cancellation of existing state contracts, and compelling orders and fines. End of quote. This, of course, is the basis of the DA's challenge of this particular piece of legislation and the quotas, the race quotas that are now going to be set by the minister, not you, the business owner, not the sector, not the industry, which lives the reality of trying to comply with these race-based laws, but effectively the minister now, a politician, will determine these numerical targets and proceed to punish businesses that are unable to meet them. This is, as the DA puts it, plainly unconstitutional. It is a rigid, one-size-fits-all model that violates the Constitution, as the DA puts it. That's the DA's argument in this one, and it's an argument which, as I argued, is firmly against the imposition of race quotas, and they deserve our support because, again, I am part of the many South Africans who are simply fed up with the racialism and the race obsession in this country. I would love a workplace, I would love a society that is actually defined by non-racialism, not the slippery, snake-tongued forked tongue approach of the ANC of saying, oh, let's use race but call it non-racialism, but actual non-racialism, where workplaces are defined by merit and indeed defined by giving opportunity to the most deserving. So that this is actually the approach that I would prefer, one which is based on non-racialism. Race should not be the deciding factor in a society like ours, despite our history, of course, where colonial and apartheid politicians used race and racism to divide society, to pick winners and losers. Again, don't take it from me. Here is John Foster himself, a former prime minister of apartheid South Africa, in an interview describing exactly that they use race to reserve jobs, to pick winners and losers in society. Watch.
Well, and as far as the so-called job reservation is concerned, it deals with less than 3% of all the workers. But it is a question of protecting certain workers who cannot do anything else but that particular work.
Well, when I was in Durban a dozen years ago, if you wanted to drive a taxi, you had to be a white man. Is that also the case now?
No, there are taxis owned and driven by whites, there are taxis owned and driven by coloreds, and there are taxis owned and driven by blacks.
So that there has been improvement on that particular point?
As far as I know, that has always been the case. It might have been just different in Durban, but in Cape Town, as far as I know, it has always been the case.
Well, what jobs are excluded to blacks? You say only 3%. Would you give me a description of a job that a black may not hold?
No, candidly, it's not a question that he cannot hold that particular job. It's a question that the whites who are holding that particular job, because they can do nothing else, are protected in that job. But I can't think of any practical example just at the moment. Because as I've told you, it refers to less than 3% of all work.
Yes, the exact same mentality that you'll hear from an ANC politician today, or indeed any other race-obsessed political elite today. An idea that somehow society must be segmented by race and opportunity accorded accordingly by race too. It is absolutely immoral nonsense, and it's exactly what I'm saying should not be what the ideal South Africa is. The ideal South Africa is a non-racial one defined by freedom and where opportunity is accorded equally to all South Africans, regardless of race or gender. And that if you are going to have empowerment policies that seek to redress the imbalances of the past, the best way to do that is to do things that actually address what makes people currently disadvantaged. Don't try and prosecute the past. Deal with what is currently the situation for those who are underprivileged, and that is dealing with whether they are poor or not. That should be the metric, not race. Poverty should be the metric that decides who gets an empowerment leg up. And that is the subtle difference in what I argue should be the approach to our society and empowerment versus what our opponents argue, who prefer race and indeed use race, not because they are fixing the past as they often claim, but actually because using race allows them to be the corrupt grifters that they are. What do I mean by that? Well, what have we seen for the last 30 years? The last 30 years under this ANC government, race has been used as the metric by which they pick winners and losers, because they know that it will be the most privileged and the most politically connected of the said beneficiary race who will get access to empowerment deals. Why do I say this? Well, have a look at the scandals that often rock our newspapers of individuals, black individuals, who are front of queues of black economic empowerment laws or even employment equity laws. And that's often why it is the most privileged and politically connected of the target race, namely black people, who will fight you tooth and nail for the preservation of using race as a metric and not poverty as a metric for deciding who benefits from these sort of empowerment or equity arrangements. They don't do this because they care about black people. They do this because they care about lining their own pockets. And they recognize that these race-based laws give them the advantage even over other poorer black individuals. This is why I call race-based pieces of legislation, whether they are BEE or employment equity, immoral and indeed a grift by these individuals. There are better ways of organizing society in a non-racial way, an actual non-racial way. And if you are going to have empowerment type legislation to try and fix the past, the best ways are always going to be non-racial, based on investing in people, getting them out of poverty, having them earn an income, from earning an income, people being able to build household savings, and from those household savings, people being able to buy themselves a higher standard of living. And all of that can be done without focusing on people's race. Again, that's my 2 cents on this issue. Let me know what you think in the comments. All right, that's it from me in this particular episode. Let me know what you think. Maybe you're someone who loves the idea of continuing to perpetuate race and racism as how we organize South Africa. Maybe you're someone who's like, yeah, let's support the ANC in using race, just like the colonial era politicians, just like the Apartheid era politicians. Let's continue to call South Africans black, white, Indian, and colored. Maybe you're someone who agrees with me that we should abandon race and actually use non-racialism and build a non-racial South Africa. Let me know what you think in the comments. And with that being said, thank you so much for watching. We'll keep an eye on the DA's court case on this matter. And as always, we'll be watching.